We've seen this slide already back on that first course where we were talking about the different components that make up our Veeam backup and recovery infrastructure. And out of these, I want to focus on the top half here, where we have just some differences, really not a lot, but some important differences here that we have to think of as we start integrating them with a Hyper-V environment. The first of these is the repository server, which out of all of these is perhaps the least different from what we've seen already. We've already configured a repository server here. It's essentially just a bunch of disks associated with a machine. And so whereas the repository server itself is not all that different, we're still attaching to a Windows server. Oftentimes it's a physical Windows server on which those disks are connected, or another server that's directly attached to a storage device. Where things do get a bit different is here with our mount server. Back with the VMware environment, we had that special file system there with VMFS that was not one that could be read by a Windows machine. In order to attach to that Windows repository from a VMware-based infrastructure, we had to have that vPower NFS service that was installed there on the mount server, which would enable NFS and grant access then to the hypervisor. We don't necessarily need that here in this environment because our virtual machines run on REFS, our virtual machines run on NTFS, and one Windows machine can easily access the disks of another. And so the mount server here is only slightly different in that vPower NFS is no longer required here. Those processes of attaching them to our repositories, of doing those instant VM restores, all just happen over the traditional file systems that work here in the Windows OS. Now that is the main difference over there on the repository and mount server side. Here on the proxy server, as we'll find out in a minute, what we actually have are two different kinds of proxy servers that we have to think about. These two types of proxy servers are an on-host proxy versus an off-host proxy. And we give them a slightly different name here because although they are very similar to the virtual appliance mode versus the direct attached to storage mode that we had there with VMware, they are just a bit different in how they interact. Because our hypervisor here is the Hyper-V hypervisor, and because the operating system is usually the same operating system as the rest of the virtual machines, the primary partition there that the hypervisor uses is one on which we can actually install pieces of software. And so there isn't necessarily the need to have a virtual appliance running as a virtual machine inside our hypervisor environment. We had to have that in the VMware world because we couldn't install code onto VMware's hypervisor. And so the left option here, the on-host proxy, is not so much a virtual appliance that exists as a virtual machine, but rather we simply just install Veeam's components onto the primary partition, that main operating system that existed before we ever installed Hyper-V and began running virtual machines. This on-host proxy will facilitate all the usual processing of a backup job, compressing it, sometimes encrypting it, dealing with deduplication, and all the other items that we configure there into our backup jobs. And so an on-host proxy performs much in the same way as a virtual appliance did. An off-host proxy is more akin to the type of machine that we would have directly plugged into storage. And in fact, for an off-host proxy to work, that off-host proxy server must support some form of hardware-based VSS. This is similar to our storage snapshots extra requirements that we discussed earlier there in VMware. What this also means is that if you're looking to remove any of the excess processing requirements that the backups will engender on those hypervisor hosts, you'll want to shift towards using an off-host proxy when you can. Obviously, if you have to use services that exist on the hypervisor host there with an on-host proxy, well, all those resources that are required to then process the backups will be taken away from what's available for the running of those virtual machines. For this, I want to show you also that there's some options here in terms of your off-host proxy, your source host, your target host, and then where you can also store your backup repository. For a Hyper-V server or cluster, we can use that as a sourced host, as a target host, or as a backup repository, although it is not recommended. We can't use a Hyper-V server or cluster as an off-host proxy. Your SMB3 servers, those file servers or file server clusters, will be used as source hosts and not target hosts, off-host proxies, or backup repositories. Other physical Windows servers, however, can be used as an off-host proxy or as a backup repo. So when you start thinking about where you're actually going to put then these different components, it's this little table here that can give you a bit of assistance in helping you know where you want to install each of these pieces. Now, what we've been talking about here has to do with Hyper-V itself, so a single Hyper-V host or even a cluster of Hyper-V hosts. But many environments also use SCVMM as the management layer over the top. Be aware that there are some special considerations here for an SCVMM integration here with Veeam. SCVMM or Hyper-V clusters are required if you're going to support any live migration use cases, so moving virtual machines around. You have to have that cluster in place and then the management over the top in order to support this live migration awareness. Be aware that if you are connecting up to an SCVMM server, Veeam will use the same credentials on all Hyper-V hosts that are managed by SCVMM. And so if your Hyper-V hosts are managed using different credentials, be aware that Veeam can only support the same set of credentials for all Hyper-V hosts underneath a single SCVMM server. When you do make the installation, your SCVMM management console must first be installed on your Veeam backup server. It's that console and the automations within that are the connection point between your Veeam backup server and the rest of your VMM environment. And this probably goes without saying, but the console version for VMM must match the management server version as well. So your VMM management server and your VMM console must both be at the same version. In our environment here, I just have a single Hyper-V host that I'll show you. The process of working with SCVMM is kind of similar to what we'll see here with a single hypervisor host. There is some additional functionality and supporting of those live migration scenarios, but for our purposes here, and because we have a very small demo environment, I'll show you here in just a second the connection then to a single Hyper-V host.